Welcome back to Tales from Our Dark Past. Back in the dark past of human history, the British Witch Trials stand as a grim reminder of humanity's capacity to allow fear and superstition to take control. But among the tales of persecution and hysteria lies a sinister truth. The witch trials were a scam. And most of those who were involved knew it. They never believed the lies that they were selling and relied on an array of despicable and deceptive methods to force a confession from their innocent victims. During the 1600s and the height of the British witch trials, accused witches faced a number of flawed, barbaric, and often fixed tests to prove that they were guilty of witchcraft. These tests were often nothing more than elaborate scams and condemning illusions perpetrated by those seeking power, wealth, or even worse, revenge. It became commonplace for someone to be accused of witchcraft simply for not being liked or being seen as different. If somebody wanted to get rid of you in 16th or 17th century England, chances are you're getting accused of witchcraft. An accusation to which there was very little way out of, and one that would have grave consequences for the accused. It was a dangerous time to be an outcast, and for a woman, aging could be deadly. It was usually older women who were accused, and blemishes such as moles, skin tags, warts, scars, or any marks on the skin could all indicate that you was a witch. Even flea bites were considered to be hard evidence against you. The infamous self-appointed Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins claimed that these were the devil's marks, and that they were used as teats by the witch's familiars who would come to visit the witch during the night. It was the need to find these devil's marks that led to our first scam witch test, the cruel pricking test. Matthew Hopkins, the Witchfinder General, employed what he called searchers, women who would ambush the accused witch in her home or prison cell and strip her completely naked. Then they would meticulously search her entire body for any marks that they could claim were the mark of the devil. They even removed body hair so not to miss a single spot, and any mark or blemish that they found would be proof that you had made a pact with the devil and was a sure sign that you must be guilty. But even if you somehow passed this degrading and humiliating strip search without a mark being found, you still weren't safe from being found to have the dreaded devil's mark. The Witchfinder General claimed that the devil's mark was dead to all feeling and that it would not bleed, no matter how deeply it was pierced. He demonstrated this with the dreaded pricking test, and he employed a woman named Mary Phillips to assist him with his interrogations. Mary became Hopkins' lead pricker and quickly made a name for herself as a specialist in finding devil's marks on suspected witches. She would cruelly and repeatedly stab at the accused witch with specially designed poking instruments. These were long, sharp needles that would cause a great deal of pain for the poor soul who had to undergo this torturous treatment. Under Matthew Hopkins' command, Mary would poke and prod at the suspected witch, starting in one area, then moving to somewhere new, then on to another, violently jabbing all over the accused's body. All the suspected witch could do was flinch and writhe around. They'd shout and scream, as each jab would cause them to jolt and yell out in pain. That was until suddenly it didn't anymore. And that's because there would come a point in this despicable act where all of a sudden the cries would stop. Mary would poke, but there'd be no reaction. She'd poke again, harder just to be sure, but there's just silence, as if the accused witch hadn't felt a thing. This is the moment that Matthew Hopkins and Mary Phillips had been waiting for. Their faces light up as they declare they found it. They'd found the devil's mark where the witch feels no pain. The suspected witch would be in disbelief, but proclaiming their innocence was no good. This test was fixed against them from the start, and they was never going to pass. Those accused of witchcraft didn't stand a chance. Firstly, almost all human beings have marks on their body of some kind, especially as they grow older. A perfectly normal mole or birthmark could be all it takes to find you guilty of conspiring with the devil. The average person would quickly fail the invasive body search carried out by the searchers, and those who seemingly passed would be sure to fail the brutal pricking test that followed. The interrogators ensured that they would be able to locate a devil's mark on their victims by using altered instruments. Sometimes, after what must have felt like hours of endless pokes and painful pricking, the sharp needle being used would sneakily be replaced by a blunt one. Or at times, a specially made tool would be used where the pointed needle would push down and retract back inside the handle, much like how prop weapons for Halloween costumes are made today. When these tactics and tools were put into play, the suspected witch didn't stand a chance. They would choose a part of the body that the accused couldn't see, or strike when they weren't looking or were distracted. Then they'd carry out their wicked deception. As soon as their victim failed to react, they knew that a confession would soon follow. The Witchfinder General would make them confess, confronting them with the undeniable evidence that they possessed the devil's mark. Those accused would often confess and even incriminate other townsfolk just to get the torment to stop. Our next deceiving witch test isn't just bizarre, it's outright disgusting. This once trusted and revolting witch-catching method involved making a stomach-churning witch cake. But a witch cake isn't just your average cake. It's got an unusual ingredient that you won't find at your local store. If you believed that your loved one was suffering at the hands of a witch, you could make them a witch cake to reveal who the dark magic or curse was coming from and expose the witch who was guilty of doing them harm. To make a witch cake, you first need some flour. This was usually rye. Next, you'd need to collect the urine of the person who was being afflicted by witchcraft. Then you'd bake the flour and urine into a cake, and your witch cake was ready to eat. Luckily, this disgusting recipe wasn't actually eaten by people, but was instead fed to an unfortunate dog, sometimes the family pet. It was believed that after the dog had consumed the urine of the afflicted by eating the witch cake, the dog would then take on the sufferer's affliction, relieving them of their suffering or curse. Not only this, but it was also believed that the dog would then reveal the person or people responsible for the infliction by guiding them to those who were committing these unholy acts of witchcraft. 17th century England was a bad place to be an animal lover. If you were seen giving fuss and attention to a dog that had, unbeknownst to you, been fed a witch cake, you could be accused of being a witch, and that would be used as damning evidence against you. Dogs were chosen because they were seen to be favourable witches' familiars, so it made sense back then that the dog would return to or be close to the suspected witch. Later on, the act of making and using a witch cake was considered to be an act of witchcraft in itself, and the witch cake method of testing was famously condemned by Reverend Parris, who claimed it to be going to the devil for help against the devil. But by then, countless innocent souls had already lost their lives to this outrageous and ridiculous method, and the witch hunt was still far from over. Although all of these tests would eventually lead to the suspected witch's death one way or another in the majority of cases, no test was as deadly or as terrifying as the swimming test. This method was also known as the ducking test and was used often by the Witchfinder General Matthew Hopkins during his investigations. The swimming test really was one of the most nasty, unfair, and diabolical methods used to catch a witch, as really there was no way for any suspected witch to ever beat this test. The only prize for winning the swim test was death, so it's not even really a test that you'd want to win. Then if you somehow survived, which many did, your fate would be much worse. If someone accused you of witchcraft in 1645 England, then you would likely have been unfortunate enough to find yourself in Matthew Hopkins' evil clutches. You stood very little chance of making it out alive, and once you found out that you were being taken for the dreaded ducking test, you'd know that your fate was sealed. First, you'd be taken to a body of water, like this large pond in Mistley, England, where Matthew Hopkins would often take suspected witches to perform his appalling swimming tests. Often a bridge would be used. This bridge over the Mistley ducking pond isn't the original, but is similar to one that was used by the Witchfinder General. This would be a public display, and it would be common for many angry townsfolk to have gathered to watch your grisly fate unfold, only adding to the fear and hopelessness of your situation. You'd then be bound in long, thick ropes and lowered over the side of the bridge and into the cold, murky water below, whilst the jeering crowds above watch on, yelling and scorning you. If you sank to the bottom and drowned, you would be declared innocent of witchcraft and to be with God in heaven. Your name would be cleared, but at the cost of your life. Although it could be said that those who succumbed to the wicked swimming tests were actually the lucky ones. As if you managed to survive this terrifying ordeal, your torment and anguish would be prolonged even further. It was believed that if you was innocent, then you would sink like a stone, but that a witch would be rejected by the water, which represented the holy water of baptism, and they would appear to float on the surface as if the water was repelling them. Specially designed ducking stools were also used throughout these tests, and the accused witch would be bound tightly to a large chair and dunked into the freezing, dirty water. If they survived this cruel treatment, then it was deemed that witchcraft must be at play, and they were found guilty. If you survived the perilous plunge, you would be pulled back up out of the water as furious crowds berate and attack you. Then you'd be declared guilty of witchcraft and sentenced to be executed. It was a lose-lose situation to be in, where all roads led to death. Even passing the awful ducking test could only happen after you had lost your life. There were some attempts to save those that drowned, but usually their innocence wasn't declared until it was already far too late. And those that floated and did survive certainly never did so by means of any witchcraft or magic. It was usually just the buoyancy of the victim's clothing, the material used to bind them, and other environmental conditions that would ultimately decide their fate. As well as being utilised to catch witches during these despicable swimming tests, ducking stools were also used throughout history as a punishment, mostly for women, for an array of different and usually not very serious crimes, including being too outspoken, behaving immorally, baking bad bread or brewing bad beer, and you could even be ducked for just disturbing your neighbours. Although in these cases, the ducking stool was not used as a test or intended to be fatal, but it was a punishment which aimed to humiliate and instill fear and terror into others to keep them in line. But unfortunately, death could often be the outcome for those that suffered this awful punishment. Matthew Hopkins and other perpetrators who employed these cruel and unfair tactics must have known that what they were doing was wrong at the time. The fact that they had to rely heavily on acts of deception and public hysteria means they knew all along just how unreliable the evidence and confessions that they gathered were. But yet they still instigated and partook in the brutal and unjust torture and executions of countless innocent souls. Most of whom were women, but men also fell victim to being accused of witchcraft and would too undergo the same deadly treatment as the women did. Why would they do this, you might ask? How could anybody be a part of this evil witch hunt? Well, there were many reasons as to why accusations of witchcraft ran so rampant throughout these times, but one big factor was certainly money. To put it simply, catching witches was good money. It also came with respect and prestige for those who decided to cash in on this newfound career path. Witch hunting became a lucrative form of employment for those with little else to do. Matthew Hopkins was said to be a fouled lawyer with little prospects before realizing the income potential of hunting witches. He then awarded himself the title of Witchfinder General and travelled from town to town performing his despicable business. Matthew Hopkins was earning large commissions for every witch that he caught. Records show that he was paid £23 from just the town of Stowmarket in Suffolk alone. This was the equivalent of around £4,200 in today's money, according to the Bank of England's inflation calculator. He was earning more in a day than most workers would earn in an entire month. It was said that the self-appointed Witchfinder General went on to earn around £1,000 during his short-lived career, equating to about £200,000 today. But the truth could have been much higher if you consider that he may have taken the occasional bribe or accepted personal incentives or other off-the-record payments as well. It's one of many examples in our not-so-distant history of just how easily those in power could profit from the lives of the less fortunate. Other reasons why so many innocent people were accused and charged with witchcraft was simply convenience. Many of those accused were poor and struggling, either due to bad health, old age, or misfortune. The local community would see these poor folk as a burden and a drain on their precious resources. Pointing the finger at them and yelling witch was an easy way to get rid of them. This allowed growing communities the opportunity to oust anyone who they deemed to be less worthy or productive, and gave them the chance to get anybody who they disliked out of the picture for good. Accusations were regularly weaponized in this way, and the suspected witches had little hope of fighting the accusations that they faced. It's estimated that around 50,000 innocent lives were needlessly lost during the witch trials. This hideous time spanned across multiple centuries and reached far and wide across the globe like an unstoppable plague of hysteria. Thousands died horrendous deaths and suffered greatly throughout their terrifying ordeals. Many perished in their jail cells, succumbing to the overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. Most experienced some form of torture, and many would have untreated injuries that would most likely get infected and cause them a great deal of pain. Most of the accused witches that survived their captivity were found guilty and sentenced to be executed, usually in awful ways such as hanging or being burnt at the stake. Matthew Hopkins and his accomplices were said to be responsible for the deaths of around 300 innocent people during the short height of his career between 1644 and 1646. By the time Hopkins died in 1647, he had fallen from popularity. The public had lost faith in him, and many were speaking out about his diabolical and unreliable methods. They began to begrudge paying his steep expenses, and anger arose when taxes had to be levied just to cover his costs. Some even claimed that he was a complete fraud and that his tactics amounted to illegal torture. Hopkins even tried to defend and explain his actions in his 1647 book titled The Discovery of Witches, where he outlined his wicked work. But tragically, the brutality and persecution didn't end with the death of the Witchfinder General. It was shortly after his death and the publication of his book in 1647 that the hysteria spread and began to sweep through the New England colonies. Some of Matthew Hopkins' disgraceful methods were even still used over 40 years later in the notorious Salem Witch Trials. In fact, the most famous witch cake ever baked was made in Salem, Massachusetts during the well-known and deadly witch trials that occurred there in 1692. Thank you for watching. Join us next time as we delve deeper into history's darkest secrets. Don't forget to like and subscribe if you enjoyed this video.